Okay, a couple weeks ago I mentioned that there were 3 false views of sin that John addresses. Today I want to talk about 2 of these tests that we can ask ourselves to see if God's truths have really grabbed onto us. And today you can kind of say that there's a moral test. There's a moral test of how you're living your life, and then there's a social test. But actually, I want to say that there's a test of obedience. That's the moral test, and then there's also a test of love. Okay, a test of obedience and a test of love. Look with me at the 1 John passage, our New Testament reading, verses 3 through 6. And by this we know that we've come to know him, if we keep his commandments. Whoever says to him, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. All right, 2 weeks ago, if you were here or if you listened to the sermon, what I tried to point out to you is that John 3 times, and this is like the preacher's dream, right? The 3 times in a row, he says the same thing. He says this, if anyone says, blah, 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 blah. If anyone says. Today, he actually gives us not the same phrase, but something else. And it's this, by this we know. Verse 3, and then again in verse 5, by this we know. And John is sort of inviting us to ask, do you know? How do you test, right? This question. How do you know if God's truths have really grabbed onto you? And the first thing is this moral question, or this test of obedience. Verse 3 says this, by this we've come to know him. Verse 5 says this, halfway through verse 5. By this we may know that we are in him. Okay, before we actually get to what he says, I want to remind you once again what John is doing in this letter, right? What John's doing is he's calling these people, think about this, he's writing probably in about 90 AD. Jesus died around 30 AD. You know, he's writing on the western part of what is now modern day Turkey, what would have been Asia Minor. We think he was writing from the city of Ephesus. We think that for a number of reasons. And he was writing to churches that had been established by this point, probably at least 20 years, maybe as many as 40 years. You know, John would have been establishing some of those churches in his missionary time in the 50s. And these churches, these people had kind of settled in. Maybe they'd established themselves. Maybe they, had gone from like meeting in somebody's home and they'd start to build church buildings. We know some churches go at least back to the beginning of the 2nd century. So maybe they were doing that. And they were kind of like, I don't know, they were looking at their neighbors and they were going, man, I don't know about this Christianity stuff. Maybe I should actually follow what that guy's doing. It just looks a little bit easier. Why don't I go along with all my neighbors who say that I can live this kind of lifestyle? It just might be easier to not be taunted by people and made fun of. And why don't I just go back to worshiping all of these panoply of gods? I'm called an atheist, and I'd say that I worship the one true God, and all my neighbors are making fun of me and all this. So he's bringing them back who are tempted to go away from these basics of the Christian faith, the truth of Christ's incarnation, the reality of sin, the need for the atonement, the cleansing work of Jesus. He's calling them back. And they're wrestling with this question. How do I know if I'm in Christ? How do I know if I have my life in him? And he wants them to wrestle with this. And so he answers this twice, right? And it's this question of obedience. So verse 3 again, let me read this. And by this we know that we've come to know him if we keep his commandments. Verse 5, the second part. By this we may know that we are in him. Verse 6. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the